This starting live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Oxford University Strategic Studies Group. Today, we're joined by Dr. Will Roper, fellow Oxford graduate. He was Assistant Secretary of the Force and Space Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, just handling a small pocket change of $60 billion. Dr. Roper enabled the Air Force to address modern programs like Hack-A-Sat, Hack the F-15, and more. He's breaking out of his self-proclaimed cryosleep today to talk to us about our modern defense landscape. Dr. Roper, please take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, cryosleeping fortunately can be reversed and then reinstated. So it's nice to wake up and spend time with you all. And I'll be very brief in introductory remarks because questions are much more interesting for me and I'm sure more interesting for you. But I have had an amazing 10-year run inside of defense, and the time before that was spent where you are at Oxford, being able to think about what the future would hold. And I certainly didn't think when I was studying string theory at University College that I would end up working in the United States government for the military. I was very focused on academic problems and thought that mathematics and physics and being around students and researchers is where I would pay my best dividends for the universe. But I found myself becoming a pragmatist and wanting to solve problems that I could see the solutions occur in my lifetime and hopefully faster than that. And that got me gravitated into doing research that was applied around defense problems and then ultimately inside of the government, leading change in national security itself. And it's been a fantastic journey. I've learned so much. I've worked with so many interesting people. And I think as a scientist and a problem solver by nature, I brought a different perspective to government than people who are managers or overseers, which is an important function, but a very different lens to look at national security through than someone who looks at it from a problem-solving lens. So I'll share a few insights as to what I saw the changes in national security are, the problems it creates, and with every problem there's an opportunity. It's like particle-antiparticle pairs. It's difficult to create one without the other in the real world and impossible in the physics world for that analogy. So I'll share those, share what I thought was important in terms of creating the change that would have a lasting impact on national security. And then we'll have any questions and answers that will help you. I think national security is changing away from talking about the kinds of systems that militaries need, the kinds of partnerships that they need in order to, quote, be secure. Those are important, those are necessary, but they're not sufficient conditions anymore. Because the Pentagon, and I think a lot of our allies and partners find themselves in the same trap, is there is still an older organizational and process apparatus in government than one that exists in commercial industry. And I've definitely seen in the Pentagon the lack of a peer competitor when the old Soviet Union collapsed and other problems grew in the aftermath, the counterterrorism, violent extremist organizations, very difficult problems, but they spurned a different kind of research and problem solving than competing against a peer that has roughly the same resource, the same industrial capacity, the same idea generation capacity as you do. It's a very different problem. And so the accelerator went off of high-tech development being fronted in large part by the US military into a problem of scale, getting systems that were properly scaled to deal with a worldwide global threat. And that is noble work and work that's important. So for those who participated, I thank them for their service. But it's very easy to focus on the threat of terrorism, which has always been and always will be here. You can always spend today on that threat. But you can easily become distracted and not realize while your head is focused on the ground in front of you on very important problems, finding terror cells, dealing with improvised explosive devices, protecting vehicles against them, protecting soldiers and Marines. And you can just keep having more problems to solve that are important, but they're not strategic. meaning they will not likely threaten the longevity and health of the nations that are trying to solve them, though they're exceptionally important in the day-to-day sense and exceptionally important for the people that they affect. But they don't risk the long-term competitiveness, the long-term advantage of the nations that are looking at them. And from that point of view, they're not strategic problems to solve. What I found that the United States government and the military especially had stayed in the rut of being able to solve problems through money, through purchasing solutions. And the purchasing system still mirrored the Cold War, where the government would have to invent the technologies that it would need for advantage, where they took a long time, a lot of resource to create. And it's amazing that a lot of the technologies that have now created the internet of things around us originally began under military R&D, when that R&D was exceptionally challenging. And the process works pretty well in the Pentagon if you live in a world where you have to create most of your technology, and technology is not being created in the outside world. It works very well. It won the Cold War. It's a very expensive process. It's a very slow process, but it was able to invent satellites, stealth, GPS that ended up changing the landscape of warfare. And of course, you know, the counter argument to that is that that's not the world today. That is why national security is being challenged in ways it hasn't before. That old Cold War model, the Pentagon created 80% of the total R&D. It was funded 80% of the R&D of the United States was military R&D, and that ratio has now flipped. Now 80% of the US R&D is in commercial, and most of our opportunities are in commercial technology. The speed that they bring, the capital that comes in from private markets is an incredible advantage if you can harness it for national security ends. But the rub is it wasn't created for those ends. You can't treat it as though you were the inventor, the owner, the sole proprietor of them. You have to leverage them as they are. You have to become a synergistic relationship with them, a catalyst for them. But you can't control them the way the military could in the Cold War. The Pentagon has struggled with that. It has generally struggled with things created outside of its five-sided walls. And that was most of what I championed in the Air Force, is we have to learn to be comfortable with commercial technologies, commercial processes, commercial companies, but we can't treat them the same way we do the defense primes. We can't engage the same way we do in big billion-dollar procurement. One, it's too slow, and two, it's too damaging to many of those companies' commercial trajectories. So the things I thought were really interesting, and we can talk about anything in depth that you'd like. I found software an interesting challenge. Like that was an amazing problem to try to solve. You come in from this digitally connected world where software is in everything, and everything's connected, and everything shares data with everything else. And you enter a military where almost nothing's connected, and very little has cutting edge software in it. And there's no equivalent military Internet of Things. Everything is just an isolated island. And that was an amazing challenge to try to take on. And it had to be started with first principles. We had to learn to code. We had to learn to value code. There's a culture aspect to it. Then create a lot of companies. They're not actually companies, but software factories that bring best industry practices and culture to get to bear on military problems, federate them across the Air Force and Space Force, and then finally move them into enterprise-wide infrastructure, multi-security cloud, and then finally keep up with commercial trends in software like containerization and Kubernetes that finally unlocked getting to something in the military that feels like a commercial capability. And that was an AI demonstration we did just in December of last year. So December of 2020, the first time that AI has been put in control of a military system. And what a sad thing to say. It took that long to do it. But it's because the foundations of being a good digital force weren't there. And it's impossible to take advantage of commercial opportunities, the majority of which are in de-risk software-related technologies, you're not a service that has the infrastructure and the know-how to ingest software-related capabilities quickly. So that's an example. You can't go create your own software process. You have to use what commercial industry is using because it's moving faster than you can create your own, and it's fueled by so much resource than you can bring to bear. As even a large organization like the Air Force is still a drop in the bucket compared to the market opportunity that commercial markets represent. So that was an example of a challenge that is needed to be an ingester, a leverager of technology. And we overhauled how the procurement system works with commercial startups and venture capitalists so that companies could mix money that came from government sources and private sources. It makes sense that if you can work with government customers and private customers, you ought to have an advantage over counterpart companies that couldn't. But the system actually penalized them from having commercialization potential. So we changed that and we brought 2,300 companies into the Air Force. It's really exciting, amazing agility, speed, creativity, all the things that we really want. And finally, the thing that I was just fascinated with is commercial related technologies that aren't really a warfighting technology, though I'm always excited about warfighting technologies. They were things like Kubernetes and containerization that changed the way in which we build things themselves. And I was fascinated with digital engineering, which several industries can claim they birthed it, but I think the automotive industry can claim rightly that they first brought the technology into its full instantiation. And to see what it has done to industries that have fully unharnessed it, and to think about what would happen if we applied it in defense just gives me hope that we could have hardware related processes that are just as agile as software related ones. And only a few programs have fully unlocked it. And, the T7 trainer is one that probably most well known, was able to say that the next generation air dominance platform, flight demonstrator that we built and flew, leveraged digital engineering. Some missile programs are as well, but it's not enough yet to look at what the revolution could be. I could go on, but I'll stop there. There are many things like this. The reason I like them is that one, they're fueled by commercial technology, so we don't have to fund them ourselves. Two, they speed up the pace at which we build things, and they increase our agility, the ability to bring in new capabilities, new technologies, ingest them quickly, easily through having interfaces and standards, APIs that don't force you to rebuild things every time there's a new update or a new widget, a new application. I thought that was really important. And I'll end on the reason why, and then we'll do questions. The thing that underlies everything in the Pentagon, and I think it's true of any Western military, and it takes a while to truly understand this because the process is massive. It's Monty Python would have a field day trying to explain how military capabilities are actually made, and I would love to see that skit. But it really starts with this presumption that you can predict future threats, and you won't find that written down. You'll find like a process that starts with requirements. It says, here's what we require. Military men and women will give to someone like me a set of requirements, which is what they need. And then we go purchase it in the best way we can, design it if it doesn't exist. But to know what you actually require means that you fully understand the problem and the environment in which you're solving it. And that was true more or less in the Cold War. We knew who the adversary was. We had very good intelligence. We could predict the moves they were going to make. And there weren't wild cards coming at us from commercial enterprise. It wasn't like while building stealth airplanes in the Air Force, we were worried about a commercial company selling their stealth airplane to people everywhere. That just didn't exist, Technology was very expensive in the Cold War. Computers were still very hard and challenging. Right? You were a genius if you could take a breakthrough in miniaturizing or ruggedizing computers to then put them on something like a high-end aircraft or satellite. So just the computers took a PhD before you ever got to building something with them. And now you all know computers are easy. So that's just such a different period to think about. One where technology was, it was only coming from you. You had an exclusive right to it, and now it's everywhere. And that's the biggest threat to the process that I see is that the biggest disruptors of national security are not likely to come from militaries. They're going to come from private enterprise. They're going to come from commercial technology that will change the landscape of the world and will have severe national security impacts. Artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, energy. There's so many things that could really change the world for good, but with a dark side as well. And the question I ask myself, is the military ready to be the most agile to deal with them? If you can't predict them, which means you have a requirement, then your requirement has to change to one that's not about knowing the future and more about being more responsive and reacting to it and being able to take an opportunity and turn it to your advantage, take a detriment and spin it around and mitigate it. And that is not the way the slow, methodical machinery of the Pentagon works. And so that's a big sell actually for military leaders, is to try to tell them you don't know the future anymore. So let's be a different kind of company, one that does not believe it will have an exclusive right to any technology, meaning if we've made it, we have to presume our opponents can make it too. Hypersonic weapons, everyone will have them. Stealth, everyone will have it. Satellites, everyone will have it. No matter what you think of, your counterpart's going to think of it too, and they'll have the resource and industrial base to build it. So how do you possibly survive when you are faced against a peer of that caliber and a tech ecosystem that's changing? And I think the answer is agility, just being able to say there was just a breakthrough in artificial intelligence and I can now get it into my military systems in a month. And then once that's possible, in a week, and once that's possible, in a day. And I think that window of application is the next competitive environment. And the final thing I'll say is if you believe that the future threat isn't predictable and you have to be agile, that the most agile military will be able to win, I think there's a second part to that, which is you've got to start treating commercial innovation as a battlefield in and of itself. You can't just sit back and wait for opportunities to be produced anymore. It's too passive a posture. If you have a relationship with the movers and shakers in future commercial tech, that will speed up your agility. It will give you an advanced insight to what you need to be ready for. And that goes back to you need to work in the full ecosystem. You can't sit behind five-sided walls and hope that working with defense companies only will keep you safe. You've got to open up the doors, take down the walls, build partnerships with new companies, new industries that are not currently engaged in defense. So if they happen to be the sector that makes the next breakthrough, you statistically have better odds of being nearer to that breakthrough and faster in turning it to your operational advantage. And when I look at the Pentagon, the military, that kind of more comprehensive view of national security that views any technology anywhere as a potential national security threat and opportunity is lacking, and one that will continue to need to be grown. And it's one I'm passionate about. And now that I'm on the outside of government, I can participate on the other side of the equation, working with commercial companies who are interested in working in national security, that don't want it to be their entire identity, but that have no idea how to engage militaries in a way that does not pull them off of their commercial track. And although I have ideas on that, there's a lot that can be improved over what I started in the Air Force, and I hope I'll be able to do that in career number 2 of my life. With that, let's take your questions, and anything's fair game, folks.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Roper, for that really brilliant overview of the changing landscape for national security, and especially the way that private industries are disrupting that. So we're going to move on to the Q&A aspect of our event tonight. For that, I would like to ask, if you're on the call, to please use the raise hand function or type your question into the chat and we'll read it out. And if you're joining us from YouTube, please feel free to write a question into the chat there, and a committee member will read that out too. So to start off, we've got a lot of hands already. I think the first hand I saw go up was Matthew. So Matthew, if you'd like to take it away.
Sure. Thank you very much. So you mentioned this agility with all of these new companies. Well, great. From my own perspective with Cyber Command, I've seen a lot of scenarios where usually defense primes are getting cyber capabilities that people don't own the source code once they're in the military and they can't change them, or you're on an aircraft and suddenly you don't have any control over the source code for all of the LRUs on the aircraft. And so you have no capabilities to actually change anything. So how do we get those defense primes moving into a more agile landscape, or is that just not possible?
It's a good question. I mean, in the Cold War model, platforms didn't change for decades, and that's still true today. So there's nothing better than winning a new platform competition and knowing it will be sustained by the service that awarded it for the next 30 years, which is why locking in to modernization and sustainment revenue streams was so important for defense primes. And I would tell a lot of military leaders, this isn't industry's model. I heard so many people in the Pentagon talk about the primes as if like they created this model that's in their advantage. And that's not true. The government always leads the dance. It's our purchase. It's our incentives. Industry brings us what we want. And unfortunately, what we've shown we want is awarding platform contracts generationally and putting most of the revenue opportunity in modernization and sustainment. Well, what does that do to you if the competitions only occur every other decade? It makes them existential in nature. You have to win them in many cases. So you buy into them. You put your own capital on the table to ensure you win. You lose money in design to make it back later in modernization and sustainment, which means locking in to software, ensuring that you control the modernization destiny of that platform is what you have to make your business case close. So when people ask me, how will we possibly be able to have the rights to software, be able to see source code, you simply have to have a business model that rewards industry for that. And it is very possible. It's just not the model we have today. There are two things you could do. You could flip to a very design-focused model. So think of this as like Apple's model for building a phone, vice a carrier like Verizon selling you a phone at a much cheaper cost, but it comes with a tail attached. You can have the phone for cheap, but now you're attached to a data plan that you can't get out of easily. Apple just is looking for a fair return on the hardware. We could do that with industry. We could pay a fair rate for design and initial procurement so that industry has recouped their investment. Now, the sticker shock of that would probably catch Washington, but we would be free after that to go wherever we want to modernize it in any way that we would see. And I definitely think that can be explored for some programs. And I was really pushing that for the future of combat aviation, the sixth generation fighters, is to pay more for upfront design and procurement so that we had more control of modernization and sustainment, would not be forced to hold on to the platform as long, and be able to retire platforms earlier and afford to start new ones. So shifting money, business opportunity forward. And I think that should be tried. But until a daring program tries that, and by the way, I actually ran the number, you can pay a lot more for the like drive away cost of an airplane and still pay less overall. And every person knows that just because a car is a cheap price to drive off of the lot doesn't mean that the total ownership cost is better, right? Well, how often does it break down? What does it cost at the pump? Every person knows that the sticker price is more than belies actually what ownership cost. And that is so true in the military. And that sticker price we pay is just a small fraction of the total ownership cost of it. So that's, I think, the big solution is to go like the automotive industry, start separating companies that design from those that produce, give a fair return for design, and have greater access to IP in those designs. But until that happens, I think things that we can contractually require is that industry owns their source code, but we have to have access to it for security scans. I think that's something that we've ceded and we need to take back. If it's running in our jet or our ship or our ground vehicle, then we have to be able to certify the safety of that system. That doesn't mean we own the IP, but it doesn't mean we need access to it. And two, I think there's a lot we can do with zero trust and containerization technologies to isolate black boxes that we don't understand and hot start over to code that we trust more if we want to give warfighters the ability to use something that may be used at risk without having a plan B or a plan C to fall back to. I think all of those should be pursued as options. But shifting to a design-centric procurement model is desperately needed. If you've never thought about it, think about this. Every system that you see in the military today, except for maybe the really old ones like the B-52, industry lost money to design it. How can we possibly be a cutting-edge military if industry always loses money designing? But that is the way the system works. And it's going to take daring programs to come in and say, there's a reason why Apple's products are pretty awesome, right? They're a design-centric company, and the model they use to engage consumers recompenses them for that design prowess.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Our next question is going to come from Will Evans. If you'd like to go ahead.
Oh, hold on. Hello. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting, Dr. Roper. Thank you very much. If you walk into a technology startup in California, you'll be surrounded by 25-year-olds working in a very flat management system which fosters creativity and innovation. You walk into any Western military or Western defense bureaucracy, you're faced by a ranked system, a hierarchy, and sort of adherence to rules and regulations. And the youngsters in the room will often not speak because they're not asked to speak, and they are often the most junior people in the room. What is the journey the American bureaucracy, defense bureaucracy, and military are on to get the best out of your young people in that sense of innovation and creativity so they can speak up even if they're the most junior rank or official? Over.
It's a very good question. It is something that makes us very different from a commercial tech company. Even though I tried to really brand the U.S. Air Force as the world's greatest tech company, the hierarchy was something that sometimes made it feel very differently. There are a couple of things that worked for me, none of them perfectly, so I'll own that. One was creating rankless structures. So if you've heard of the software factories that we create across the Air Force, Kessel Run, Kobayashi Maru, you walk into them, you'll think you're in a tech company. The look, the feel, the branding is there. Everyone's in civilian clothing, hoodies, t-shirts. You have no idea who's military, who's civilian, who's officer, who's enlisted. It's first name basis. That worked really well, surprisingly well. There was some fear about that within the Air Force, and definitely had some lawyers look at whether we could do that or not. But if you make it feel like a tech startup, it acts like a tech startup. And because there's a cool factor in the military, tech startups are viewed as just the hip place where there's agility, creativity. Even our more senior officers really wanted to get those assignments. They were looking more for the environment, the energy, not to be called sir or ma'am. So that worked really well, not perfectly, but I think that's something that can be explored in bureaucracies. Thing two, which is probably the more important thing to do, is really focusing on culture, which is not something that's done very often in the Pentagon. It focuses on organization and process. I think military organizations really like organization and process, but they suck for creating creativity. No one's said, oh my goodness, it's such a beautiful organization chart. I feel inspired to go out and change the world. And no process actually solves wicked hard problems. People do that. But people need to be organized in some way. And I think culture is the minimum viable product of organization that allows problems to be solved to their maximum effect. It's a mission statements. What's the problem we're trying to solve? What do we value? And how do we measure ourselves towards those set of values? And if you get those right, then creative people will go do creative things. And I just found that just not the way that government leadership is formed. Most government leaders reorganize and change the process. And although you can say on paper you did something, in practice, nothing really changes. That fit really well for the Air Force. I don't know if it would work in every organization, but there's a pilot mentality in the Air Force where older officers know they're not the best pilots. They know it's the younger pilots that are far better. They will all say, like, you know, I can't multitask the way that they can. So that's helpful because it means it's not the most senior person in the room that you want to have in the chair at the time of decision. You want the most capable person. And I found that, you know, you could create in the innovation space the same thinking that occurred in the pilot space. Yes, you have the senior officer who's there because of their wisdom and experience, but that doesn't mean they're going to be the most creative person, the ideator, the incubator. That could very well be the captain. And a lot of the colonels and lieutenant colonels, general officers really responded to this, right? Where they were shepherding and unleashing captains and lieutenants. And those that did, I think, really saw the benefit from it. But I will own there were some that just never liked it. And those captains and lieutenants were people that I had to protect from my seat. So not a perfect solution, but I think within that space, there are things that bureaucracies can do to try to deconstruct themselves and create a culture that can work in the gaps of that bureaucracy. Culture, you know, works all the time. You don't have to go in and check on it. So I'm a big believer that that's the way to do it. And I think culture can be copied in almost any organization, even outside of military ones.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. So we have a related question here in the YouTube chat. Jaspreet Singh asks, do you believe there are cultural pressures that are limiting modernization in the DoD? For example, autonomous and remotely piloted aircraft systems may limit the role of pilots in the United States Air Force. And with pilot leadership, may this hinder modernization?
There definitely are. It took me a long time to truly understand how things actually get fielded in the military. And then even more interestingly, you wouldn't think this is an important question to ask. How do they get retired? If you want to really understand the answer to your problem, it's better to start with the latter. How do you get rid of something? It's really hard. And that will actually highlight most of the parochial fears. Well, one, if you're trying to quit doing something, someone loves it. Someone's benefiting from it. It's in a state. It's in a congressional district. It's at an air base. It's in a segment of industry. And that state, that district, that company, they already have a caucus of people who want things to stay the way they are. And they will fight to keep things from changing. And it's huge influence, especially when you have very strong forces in Congress who say, regardless of what you think you need to be a military, I'm going to tell you, you have to keep maintaining these old airplanes. So just know, one, even where there's disruptive thinking, I saw the Air Force try to retire a lot of its old airplanes and be told no by the Pentagon and no by Congress. So sometimes you don't even get a chance to take a swing at the plate. You're told to just sit in the dugout and let someone else do something that's more conservative. For those that do take on disruption, then they fear the loss of money. If you say you don't need to do something anymore, like we don't need as many manned fighters and we're going to do unmanned instead, you could really want to do that. But a fear that military leaders will have and civilian leaders is that the second you say something isn't needed, that money will be taken and given to something else. And the fear for every service, which is to be overtaxed, to be smaller than they need to be given 1.5 times the missions they can actually perform and know they don't have the assets to do it. So it creates this better to get that than the thing we really want mentality. And then finally, yes, there is some parochial fear about changing, from manned to unmanned, from human intelligence to artificial intelligence. But I really saw that changing in the Air Force. The fears of losing money and the real effect of having Congress tell you no and being forced to keep an asset that has less and less military utility were the biggest impediments to innovation.
Thank you so much for that. Our next question is going to come from James. If you'd like to go ahead, James.
Hi, Dr. Roper. Thank you very much for talking to us. I've heard a wide range of cost estimates for GBSD, and I know some of those are presented by people who are but I know GBSD is an example of digital engineering. So expect those costs to come down, or is it just horrifically expensive to buy missiles? And do you think that GBSD is one of the programs that's driven by the precedent of having a land lag, or do you think that ICBMs will be a strategy for a while?
A lot of questions there. Let's unpack them. So GBSD, ground-based strategic deterrence, the Minuteman III replacement, is one of the most stunning examples of digital engineering in the department. It's amazing what that team has done. That's why GBSD costs have remained uninflated. They haven't grown. They've remained steady. I think there's been less than 1% cost growth in a program. And one of that size, that's amazing. Total program cost, I think, was around 60 billion, but the Air Force will have that on their website. Digital engineering doesn't change the cost of material. So what I see it doing on GBSD is simplifying software, simplifying assembly, simplifying integration. And because integration is easier, you're giving engineers more time to really solve problems. Engineers in defense really quit doing engineering decades ago. They started working integration. Digital engineering, because it makes integration easy, actually restores good engineering where you're working on performance and cost, not just getting things to connect together. So that's actually the secret sauce in digital engineering, is simplified integration and the ability to make concurrency something that's good and not bad. But it's not going to change the price of solid rocket motors. It's not going to change touch labor that you can't get out of your system. And GBSD when you actually look at what's required for it, it's crazy. It is developing, fielding, and replacing an ICBM every week for 9 years straight across hundreds of miles of space and facilities, over 500 facilities that have to be built and everything integrated together. I mean, it's one of the most comprehensive integrated weapon systems that's ever been taken on in the department. And the only thing that let me get a little sleep at night was knowing that it had this fantastic digital engineering backbone to be able to work integrating that complexity easier. And I'm rooting for the team that they'll be able to pull it off. And in terms of the future of the program, whether we have a triad, a dyad, that's an important policy decision. That's something that it appears that there will be new thinking on. And that was outside of the work that I did. I was an executor of programs, so I tried to make sure all of our nuclear programs were in good shape. The number we need and how many we need of them, those are things for policy types and warfighters to make. And I don't think anyone's going to switch from a triad to a dyad willy-nilly. I think there'll be a lot of thought put into it. But the key for the acquisition teams is to ensure that any decisions that are made because of policy and not because of programmatic necessity, meaning a program has gotten to be so expensive it's no longer affordable. And digital engineering is really opening up new affordability. I mean, when I awarded T7 and the cost of the program came in $10 billion lower than our service cost, something remarkable happened. I mean, that never happens. And that's what really got me looking at what is digital engineering really doing? And it does what I just said. It allows you to digitize things that before had to be done in the physical world. And most amazingly, it simplifies assembly and makes concurrency something that can be an ally. And if you use that to your advantage, you can get touch labor and direct and indirect cost out of programs and pass those direct savings over to the services and the taxpayers. So it's an amazing technology, but it doesn't solve everything. And but there's not a single program that I would envision starting in future that wouldn't benefit from using a fully digital approach. But you've got to start from day one with that. It's very difficult, from what I saw, to put it in after the fact. You're either digital from birth or you never are.
Thank you very much. So circling back to a few of your earlier points, Jeffrey Alston asks, is the current discourse with the F-35 representative of legacy requirements thinking? And what needs to change in DoD procurement to realize your vision of agility?
Yeah, I mean, I think F-35 is an example of a program that's born out of the old system. And, the history of it is self-evident online. A lot of things that I'm sure seemed like a good idea at the time, but in hindsight, it's just really hard to understand why they were undertaken. I mean, the program began with rapid prototyping and a fly off of an A-type model, the Air Force model, and then something else altogether was procured. So you'll hear the term "fly before you buy" in the Pentagon, but we flew and then we bought something else, right? But regardless of whether that happened or not, the F-35 in every program of that older age is an analog program. It's not, they're not digitally created, which takes away a lot of agility for being able to do interesting things to them, being able to modernize them quickly, to update them quickly. I mean, the first aircraft to carry artificial intelligence and containerization was the U-2, the oldest, one of the oldest airplanes that we have in inventory. So age is not what tells you how easy it will be to work with something. It's really the design philosophy. And design philosophy is not a term you'll ever hear in the Pentagon, but design philosophies that are open allow you to bring in innovation from so many different quarters. The algorithms that we ran on the U-2 are open source algorithms. They were developed by DeepMind to be the best Go playing algorithms in the world, and you can go download them. And we used them to operate a U-2 radar because the U-2 system is an open architecture. Its design philosophy is be able to ingest development from third-party developers. Contrast that with a closed design philosophy, and you can understand the differences between a program like the F-35 or the U-2. Now, there are some parts of the F-35 that are open, but its philosophy in general is to be closed, and that's not always a bad thing. If, at least in an earlier period, closed meant you could control everything. You didn't want stuff to plug and play because that could be a vulnerability to your system, and no one wants their fifth generation fighter to be vulnerable. But I think, as I said, opening remarks, agility is everything. You've got to be a good designer, mitigate vulnerabilities, and unlock the power that agility gives, so that if a new algorithm appeared that was able to recognize, targets in radar, if that happened because of like the big boom in radar from space that so many commercial companies are trying to get into, we ought to be able to drop it onto any aircraft in the Air Force the same day it comes out with no risk to life, although there might be risk to mission. But because we don't have that design philosophy where openness is valued and rewarded, dropping anything onto any platform takes months, like years in some cases. And that's really what you see holding back legacy program. Years, you could create something completely new. And with digital engineering coming into defense, 2 years, you should be able to design and prototype a new aircraft. 3 years, absolutely. 5 years, you should be able to field a fully operational system. Years matter, months matter now in defense again. So I'm really betting on the next generation air dominance, the 6th gen platform, which is getting the benefit of digital engineering up front. And if it pulls it off and gets it right, it'll open up, I think, a new amazing period of aviation for the United States military. And if it gets it wrong, there may not be a 6th gen or a 7th, because patience is getting pretty short, and there certainly isn't going to be a lot of extra money for big failures. So I have a lot of hopes on that program, and digital gives you a lot of ability to solve problems and have smaller failures that you fix along the way, as opposed to these bigger failures that by the time you find them can be catastrophic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, next up we've got Andy. Andy, if you'd like to go ahead.
Dr. Roper, thank you so much for your fascinating insights. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but your contention is that China is probably the upcoming challenge for potentially the US military. Do you have a view as to whether there are any different disadvantages or advantages that the Chinese military has, given the system within which it operates, when compared to the American military? Thank you.
Yeah, China is definitely the competitor that we have to keep our closest and most astute eyes on. I don't think it's a fait accompli that they must be the adversary of the United States forever, but it's definitely a frenemy competition that could go adversarial, at times seems adversarial, but I'm very much hoping that that on the political side, the diplomacy side, that a new model will be worked that does not devolve into something that feels like a Cold War, but will be very different than a Cold War because of the technology landscape. But within national security and military, your job is to hope for the best, of course, but prepare for the worst. And so we have to presume that China does become a long-term adversary, and that I think you can argue today we're in that state, but that they remain there, and that we have to have a strategy for maintaining advantage in a new tech landscape, given that we are a very different nation than they are, and that the rules that applied in the Cold War don't apply here. So Soviet Union, you think about that, it's economically isolated, industrial base is isolated. There weren't global capital markets creating worldwide technology booms that could be used by everyone. So completely different. So we are economically coupled to China. Our industrial base and supply chain is coupled to our vulnerability, I would argue. And technology is being generated by both of us. It's being catalyzed by both of us. Much of it is available to both of us. And so that is such a different environment. So what do we possibly do? Where is our advantage going to come from? Where is theirs? China's advantage, I think, is obviously centralization. Their civilian military fusion model brings everything in their nation together into one apparatus that has amazing advantages in getting things started, being able to anoint national champions, companies that will be the forefront in China in a given tech field, is a huge advantage, where that company has access to commercial sectors and military sectors that are synchronized by the government. So we would be very unwise to not fear that advantage, to get started quickly. I think its disadvantage on paper, and we'll see if it ends up being in practice, that could be our advantage, is that it doesn't appear to bring market dynamics to bear. Markets have just been so good at keeping innovation fresh in the United States. But what's happened to us is .mil commercial industry, right, which is our defense industrial base, has separated from commercial industry that's not working with the military at all, that's working, with private entities selling to us as worldwide customers. .mil and .com are separate in the US. So the two markets are separate. And it's not just a lack of having a unified whole of government approach. We're actually dividing and conquering ourselves. So the thing we have to do to compete long term is find a synergistic role between military markets and commercial ones. And I think it's pretty obvious how it could work. Silicon Valley is putting 80% of their investment into de-risk software technologies. Deep tech, which are those disruptive industrial revolution type technologies, are becoming less and less represented in our nation's portfolio. Well, it makes sense that an investment firm that's looking for good returns and higher multiples will go to de-risk technology, but those don't exist for the military. So why aren't we playing a strategic role investing in more deep tech companies to de-risk their technology, to put them on a level playing field with software, people that are working in social and AI and software writ large? The other thing we need to be able to do is work with companies that are mainly going commercial, but provide opportunities from the military market. And that's a lot of the work that I enjoy doing in the Air Force that I'm doing now. Any investor is looking for first revenue opportunities for the companies they're backing, and they're often ought to be in the military, in energy, aviation, even medical, because militaries can certify their own equipment. They don't have as high of a demand, and they operate at a different risk point than commercial markets. These technologies ought to have their first entrant into the military market, generate their first revenue there, de-risk their offering to commercial markets, and give themselves an advantage. So the military market acts as an accelerant, a catalyst for commercial innovation. The last 20 years, it's been anything but that. It's been an impediment. And the best tech companies in the US have grown up with no connection to the military. In future, any technology company changing the world ought to be thought of by default. It must have worked with the military early on because of the advantages that the military bequeaths to companies, especially in their early growth stage. We have to get that right, or else China will have their advantage and we will have no counter advantage, and then see who wins with dueling advantages. So we have to do that, and it's not in place today. And I worked on that when I was in the Air Force, and I'm going to try to help do that now that I'm a private citizen. But if we do manage to pull that off, then I believe the advantage will be with markets. I think that markets provide stability and innovation, and that centralization will eventually pick a quote winner that isn't. And that can set you back for a long period of time, whereas markets self-correct and stabilize. That's a big question to try to address. I could go on for hours on that. There are a lot of details to actually think through competitive models and how to bring capital to bear and how military markets should act with respect to that capital. But if you take nothing else away from the answer has to be bigger than the military. The most significant challenges we have are in how technology is created, not just military technology, but technology that changes the economics of nations, that changes the industrial base landscape. Because when that changes, it changes the kind of military you can create. Right? As AI and additive manufacturing go across industry, they're changing the type of military systems you can make in future. So if those technology breakthroughs don't happen in the US first, there's no guarantee our industrial base will bring them to bear for military problems. The industrial base and bringing technology to market first, that is the first epic of warfare now. And the military needs to treat it as a strategic proving ground, or else it's going to find itself working with a tech base, an innovation base, an industry base that's a decade behind the times.
Thank you so much. So we've still got a number of hands here, but I think we've got time for about 2 questions. So if it's all right, can we collect both those questions and then hand over to you, Dr. Roper? So can we have Lydia give her question and then Philip, if that's all right?
Hello, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Roper. I wondered if I could please ask you, of course, there are many great benefits and innovations that can be achieved, for example, with the military and government working together with the private sector and indeed universities. But as we all know, of course, there are also risks, such as industrial espionage. So how can we mitigate those? I'm reflecting in particular on recent news that apparent links between Oxford University's Ultra Quantum Matter Lab existed and continued for some years with China's National University of Defense Technology, and these were only recently reported on and severed. And of course, ultra quantum matter research is a very exciting field with very important potential military applications. But is there a way we can encourage innovation while minimizing risks like industrial espionage? Thank you.
All right, I'm expecting maybe a second question, but I'll be happy to address that one. Look, this is what the innovation battlefield looks like now. You can't firewall yourself away from the rest of the world. I think governments need to smartly know who is working on their fundamental research. I think that is a fair ask, not just the principal investigator, but everyone that's on. But just because someone from another nation is on it doesn't mean military should immediately walk away, because technology is global. And I think the answer is just going to be is awareness, and then intelligence based on that awareness. You know, is working with a university that is in another nation, is that a detriment to national security? Or are they just simply an entity that's viewed as an academic institution in that country that doesn't have a strong tie to its military? And of course, in China, everything ties to its military, so that will set the bar at a different place. The thing I fear the most is all or nothing decisions. Like, we will not do anything for circumstances of this kind, or either lackadaisical, not actually knowing who's engaging in research on our behalf, who's on our project team, how is information being protected. I mean, just good encryption of data at rest and in motion, and knowing the credentials of all the people who have access to it would go a long way towards militaries being able to protect information, especially for early stage research. I like that the US is open, that it treats fundamental research as publishable and available to all. So, and I would not want to stop that. I think it would move us out of having access to the best minds, the best thinkers, the best innovators. But as that research starts becoming applied, we absolutely need to know who is working on our programs. I think that is a reasonable request. And almost any other engagement, employment opportunity, you're going to have to fill out your identity and background, provide references, right? That's how you get picked up for a job. Well, it's time we start doing that in the research enterprise. And for those that don't feel comfortable providing that information to the government, well, I mean, there might be people who feel that way for good reasons, but if we are an employer, if we are a funder, I think we have a right to that kind of access, that right, and just information so that we can run backgrounds and know, is someone affiliated with a foreign military, or are they just a researcher that's worked in this career their entire field, and though working with them may lead to publishable research that will be read by everyone, it's not changing, it's not going to directly inject into a military system or lead to a relationship or something like that. It's a really tough challenge for the Pentagon because it likes all or nothing rules, and I don't think that's possible. It's a very good question.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, well, as we're coming up on the hour, I think I'm going to call things for the official session there. First, I'd like to quickly ask Dr. Roper if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make.
No, thanks, everyone. Really glad you're participating in the studies group. Enjoy your time getting to think about things deeply. No one has a complete sight picture on national security. It's changing all the time. So my thoughts are just those. They're thoughts of someone who has been engaged in this struggle, and I learn every day I talk with people. So bring your thoughts and be very vocal. No one, I think, has the grand strategy yet, and I hope that as you leave your studies, that you'll be able to contribute new insights that will help us see the problem in its fullest extent. My one thing I do believe is true is that when you're myopic in doing your problem, that myopia always tends to be where the variables of greatest interest to solve it could be. And I think national security has so many new variables entering. The problem space is getting bigger, that if we bring in that myopic military platforms, operations, training, threats, we will miss most of the great opportunities to flip the script and do things differently. So best of luck as you try to find those variables and lend your voice to them.
Well, thank you so much for that very optimistic note to end on. What's left for me to say really is a huge thank you to you, Dr. Roper, for leading that really thought-provoking discussion and taking the time to engage with so many different questions and aspects of this ever-changing picture of national security. And as always, thank you to all of our members and viewers today for all of your really excellent questions. If you enjoyed this event today and you would like to join us for our last event of term, we will be meeting next week at the same time, same place, where Dr. Lindsay Newman will be speaking to us about key policy challenges facing Biden in his first year. Now, a couple final points. First of all, if you would like to get involved with the committee for next year, please do send a message to any of us. Now, this is kind of your last chance to do that, and we would love to hear from you. And finally, if you would like to spend 15, 20 minutes discussing your thoughts in a very informal session, stay on the call now, and we'd love to hear what you have to say. Dr. Roper, if you do have the time to join us for that, it would be really great to have you there, but there's absolutely no pressure either way. So thank you all so much, and have a great night.